So, Carter is a procurement and consulting forester with an agronomy and wildlife conservation background. He has experience both working for and partnering with different state and federal government agencies to achieve their forest management objectives for both public and private lands, especially throughout Missouri. Carter specializes in commercial and non commercial thinning to improve forest and woodland communities and commonly uses timber stand improvement and prescribed fire to optimize growing conditions for forest farm species. So we'll get Carter's presentation pulled up here and get rolling in just a moment. But help me in welcoming Carter to talk more about different management practices for forest farming.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Raylan. And thanks, Badger, for kicking it off right there. That was a great talk. Um, yeah, so I'm also a consulting forester, and I do historically a lot of prescribed burning and thinning, among other things. But in effort to establish forest farm plots, there's been sort of a new take and a new lens that I've sort of adapted my thinning and burning through. So I'll enjoy going through that with you guys. Um, so yeah, a lot of times I do these in isolation. Sometimes the combination of thinning is and burning actually turns out to be the best. And I'll look at some commercial thinning versus non-commercial options just because this is an agroforestry conference. And if there's a, you know, timber timber product or non-timber product out there, we want to know, the value of it future and immediately. So sort of why do we thin and burn? We're looking to optimize our forest farm operations. And really, I just want to, this talk is about establishing forest farm plots, but I think of using fire and thinning as intermediate treatments along the process as well. So spatially and temporally, these are really important tools. Um, okay, so it's just some questions to start, and we've got plenty of great minds in the room to talk about a lot of this. And yesterday, when Janine said, ask some specific questions about burning, it prompted me to change my slides up a little. So I'll rush through this a little because I have some real nitty gritty. How do we actually burn stuff to get to? But just in general, what is here? What do we have? Is there anything ecologically that we want to prioritize? And before we start establishing agroforestry plots, are we eradicating or jeopardizing anything that ecologically wouldn't pay in terms of money, or just ecological value? So yeah, and there's a lot of investment to thinning and burning. It's not always cheap. We'll talk about that, some of the rates that I charge and that the government will reimburse you for, which is generally how I like to work. Make sure that you're getting some money if you're gonna be asked to pay me some money. So um, this is traditional forestry stuff, but again, that's sort of my background where we come from. There's several types of thinning. We're pretty much focused on the very bottom, the non-commercial ones: release cuts, pre-commercial thinning, improvement cuts. Generally, TSI is non-commercial, although I've done extensive research in the Ozarks where we did take commercial overstory trees to the mill and sell them. And it was a thinning with the intention of leaving the best trees and creating oak woodlands as a restoration natural community sort of thinning. So that was from below, which you'll see can be commercial, but there's also thinning from below above. Often we're doing some combination of this. If you had a forester market, he's not thinking like traditional he's making decisions in what he sees in terms of canopy and species spatially on the landscape. And so we'll talk some more about that as well, like how we choose what to cut as we go through a thinning plot. Um, Also, I realized we haven't talked a lot about just wood values, timber value here, and I'm somebody that spends a lot on timber in this state, millions of dollars actually annually, mostly on black walnut. But a lot of people don't realize, just like when they say, oh, Missouri grows billions of dollars worth of forest product, like what it actually is and where it comes from and what's in your backyard. a lot of and we all hear the whiskey and wine barrels and bourbon barrels are all white oak staves. Um, that's a huge multi-million dollar market here that Missouri has. And if I were going to come into a plot and be asked to cut trees down and there were white oaks, I would think about like what white oaks are going to be better than these because you'd really manage for a white oak, even in an ecological sense. It's also one of our most lucrative wood products. It also just creates the best wildlife habitat and structure. And um, so anyway, white oak right now is going for like $2 a foot for the lumber. And once you really talk about like staves, probably like 250 to $3 right now. It's actually slightly higher than walnut lumber, which is actually a really interesting thing. That's a seasonal thing that's rare. But there's other like veneer logs and individual logs that are going to make thin sheets you glue on to something, either making like private trim in a jet or some face plate. That stuff's going for much higher on a finished dried um, market, above $5 a foot, $8 a foot, especially walnut. That stuff, it can go. These are ranges I have right now on the log front. If someone calls me with logs for walnut, they're going about $2 to $3 a foot. Um, Maple is only $1 a board foot. You can look up how many board feet are in a log in a tree. Generally, a tree has 200 to 300 board feet in it, just on a general. If you can hug around it, it's that or less. If you can't, you might have a big one. It's exponential the way the volume works in trees, so it's hard to guess. It may be off by double. You need to look up a volume chart. Just Google it. It's very, very easy to figure out how much volume's in a tree by the diameter. Then you can calculate your board feet and the potential value this way. Um, Other than that, things are weird in terms of market. So walnut and white oak are our two primary wood products here. And if you have those in your woodland, I'm going to tell you to manage around that, not only just for the timber value, the wood value, but the wildlife value. They're native species. They're things we should manage for the future. Um, yeah. So black cherry, Kentucky coffee tree. If you have these kind of cool things that are not going to be any problem to your forest. I don't like though, and I get asked to cut these kind of trees down frequently, and not that I haven't in terms of favoring other trees spatially on the landscape, but um, anyway, these are cool trees that I often won't include in a TSI um, job. And there's weird markets for them. Usually you can't find anyone to take them, not even your local mill for $1. But if the certain kind of a certain size, you should call around and see if your mill wants them. I've seen some crazy stuff happen with unique species like that. Um, yeah. The other thing is that if if you have a commercial sale and your woods just don't have any of these high value products, a lot of people want to still clear the woods commercially and still make a little bit, and they'll get talked into a pallet sale or a mat sale, or somebody that wants to come in and just clear it and sell it as blocking or railroad ties. And I always discourage this. Just cut them down and burn them and manage your own firewood, manage your own debris. Um, these kind of harvests just aren't really profitable for the damage they do on the landscape for in an agroforestry context. So, um, but they're common. They're probably the most common harvests across Missouri and the Midwest. This is a inventory that a forester might do if he came there. This is one that government or private consulting forester would fill out and it actually comes from a management plan, which is in the next few slides, because if you call me to even establish forest farm plan plots, I'm going to have some idea what I'm doing here, a written plan of what I'm cutting and why and how much, and where there already is AGS and UGS is acceptable growing stock, unacceptable growing stock. The BA per acre is the basal area. You'll hear me refer to that. That's just a measure of volume in the forest, basically. Then there's actual volume in terms of board feet and percent stocking. We do cull trees, snags, and that's we often tag those as wildlife trees we keep. So anyway, have your woods inventoried. That's something I would do before I did TSI or burning regardless. Like I said, I poached this from a management plan. I see Josh walked in, maybe one of his, because we have a lot of his in mine and our other consulting foresters floating around. Yeah, I'm sorry to show you pages. I hate to do that on slides, but promise I have some fire pictures at the end. You can see there's a lot of considerations, especially if this is farm bill money, equip dollars through NRCS. You'll need government signatures at the end, but they do things like archaeological and historical reference searches, and make sure you aren't just going to go into anywhere that someone wants to establish forest farm plots and start burning and thinning just because they want it. Um, and so, yeah, how much do we cut? What's there? How do we decide what to thin and why we're thinning? And in a in a good where we have these objectives written out in a plan is really the answer. Here, this one you can tell is a heavy FSI. 45 to 55 basal area is a lot. 60 to 70 being the desired future condition for wildlife habitat. That's a good woodland. That's a good open woodland. You could establish a forest farm. We talked about 60% canopy, and Raylan's talk for establishing hers. At 60 to 70 basal area feet per acre, you could grow a lot of really great forest herbs, and also have great wildlife habitat. And then you could get away with a few burns. So this one's on a northern slope. We could talk about aspect. That's a big important. You wouldn't potentially want to cut as heavy if you're going to burn and want some canopy closure on a southern aspect or an exposed aspect. Um, yeah, so when we plan that out over time, it's not just something we say we're going to do one time. It's mapped out when we're going to do it and what stands with to what level, with some built-in discretion, because some, like I said, not every year we get the fire years we need for as many fire units as we have on an individual, um, you know, one one unit. So, but this one I like because it has brush management, tree and shrub establishment, prescribed burning, wildlife habitat management, and heavy FSI or thinning. Where FSI is forest stand improvement. So these also get used synonymously with timber stand improvement. They're different, but they're the same. It depends what you start with, which we skipped over a little bit, but yeah. So you have anywhere from like a 5-year timeline on most of these for the plan date, and as long as you fulfill that requirement and the agreed upon amount with the NRCS, they'll reimburse this, so you can work with your consulting forester to pay. And that rate changes each year for heavy FSI at certain rates and prescribed burn at certain rates per acre. All right, so the burning we mentioned yesterday, I think we had a Missouri Prescribed Fire Council, and you talked, Janine, about like, can anyone just go out there and burn, and how do they think about smoke on the road locally? And is someone policing that a little? And the truth is yes. And there's been a lot of good conversation, especially in our state, with our agency folks and our consulting foresters, and just all our natural resource professionals have worked on this problem. And in 2021, they actually did sort of get this act going where as long as you have a good plan and you're not negligent, you're really not going to be shown negligent in court. And they got this amazing certified burn manager program you can do, where you do a workshop on the weekend and learn and get certified to do prescribed burns on your property. Shows you how to write a written plan. It's not legally mandated that you have a written plan, but to do this, to be protected under the certified burn manager, you want to do this. I have some plans and some bits and pieces of them, but essentially we've had success helping this stay something that you don't have to have government personnel come out and do, or that if even private contractors that aren't negligent can go get certified and get level 1 in our state, and make sure that they know how it's meant to be done. So there is a process. All plans pretty much have these same critical components, and this is outlined in this act. Actually, a map is huge. You got to have a map just so everyone's on the same page about what scale you're doing. the objectives of the burn, the weather conditions, fire breaks, number of crew members, safety and contingency plans, smoke management, notification list is huge, and then some sort of mop-up plan. And so I'll show you. Uh, yeah, I think I mentioned this, but at the bottom you can see that you really don't even have to have this approved by a government official unless you're receiving some of these cost share dollars. And so um, this is just a really good thing to know and do. And I hope all states will take this on actually. So um, yeah, I used, this is sort of a little bit made up, a little bit hybridized from some I've used because I wanted it to be partially one from Busby that I worked with Raylan on. But you can see it just general information about where you are, what it is, where, how many units there are, who owns it when you're talking about, and then some general conditions you're going to want to burn under. We have several conditions that we might want to burn under, considering what is out there and what kind of forest farm operations we're looking for, what kind of canopy conditions we're looking for. May take more than one fire over several years, which would be outlined in our plan. So then you have fire lines, another critical component. On each side we talked about, is it going to be UTV trails or hand lines? Do you burn it, blow it, rake it? Is it wet line? Is it accessible by UTV? How many people are going to man this? Ignition plans, which is much easier to see on the map, but it is written out, so I want to show that. And then the mop-up plan, just generally doesn't have to be too specific. Just make sure that somebody's sticking around to make sure nothing glows at the end. Better.
A written plan is if something goes wrong when you're following the plan and it was a defensible plan, it's, what do you say, an act of God. If you don't have a plan and something goes wrong, people will be like, well, yes, you can sue them for putting smoke on the road. So it's just a matter of responsibility.
That's right. That's right. Negligence in court has been sort of a fun, dicey issue. I have some fun stories about that after, actually, if you want to talk about that. Yeah, so how many resources you need, and this is often overlooked or winged, but this is actually some really important stuff. Somebody that knows this stuff can make a fire much safer before anyone ever goes out there or shows up, just by putting the right equipment on the site and the right amount of people. And I see that as really a big fail, almost as much as burning at the wrong time or pushing fire the wrong way. It's just people don't bring the right stuff and have the right people, and especially that know what they're doing. So this is very important. I like that cell phones are now like critical components on burn plans there at the bottom, but you got to have them. Weather monitoring, which I have some forecasts we'll show about. Yeah, back to Janine's comment earlier, is just like, who do you call for Busby? We did have to worry about Highway 54 is very close, and there's going to be smoke on the, very nearby. Luckily, the fire department is just right across the street from where we were yesterday doing the mushroom logs. And so when you call them and notify them what you're doing, where you're doing it. Don't send backup if you get calls, but every fire department's different. Sometimes they say, we're not going to send any trucks unless you specifically call me. And some fire departments are like, we don't care if anyone calls, we have to come. So Jeff said he was actually saying if we see smoke, we'll show up, but mostly because we're across the street and, we don't want to look bad. But it was great. They're usually collaborative. You always got to work with your fire department because they're the first ones coming, and they're the only hope you have if something really actually goes wrong. And they're generally the emergency medical response too, which is generally the bigger concern, is the people more so than the fire escaping and burning up useless, meaningless structures that no one cares about, like houses. Yeah, so you always have helispot places. You do think through the contingency plans, but as long as they're on paper, I've never had to use them. Go ahead.
Can you tell us the degree of burning that will attract the fire service come? I mean, is it smoke or real fire that can attract them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, when I say they're collaborative, that's a big part of calling them is feeling them out. What's going to trigger a response that you come here, and so you kind of got to know some of them are vigilant. I think they're sitting around ready to go, and you can tell if they see smoke, they're coming. And some of them, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't respond to a wildland fire. Period. That's not their jam. They do structure fire. They're structure fire people. So feel them out and ask them what prompts a response, and what do I have to do if I need you to come? You need like a safe word in, like a trigger warning. I need you to come now. Like this is immediate. So just call them and ask them what resources they have available and where, since they need to know anyway. You don't want them to show up unannounced, because you could be halfway through a really good burn and they come and put it out. I've never had that happen because I always call them, but I've heard of people in the middle of a successful burn and they show up mad and they don't care. They're putting it out because they were called to put it out. And yeah, so, but that's a great question. It often depends how rural or urban you are, how many people see it. Get away with some really big fires in the country that no one knows is happening. And then, in the neighborhood, you need a permit, and it's a whole other thing because people are standing in the alley. So this is from a model we run called Behave, and it is specifically for smoke management and risk in terms of other hazards. I just want you to know that there are tools and softwares we even run to sort of calculate these risks. So it's not just me eyeballing it and signing a value. And so these models are quick, and the software is usually cheap or free, and you can do a risk assessment. And they don't mandate that you use only Behave, but that's the most popular one. Having these are not critical in most burn plans, but they're just a really good idea. They're a really good tool. They're really easy. You can enter a lot of information in there. It'll tell you a lot of stuff that you might not know is like modeled for your region. Also, it can be way off because of course they're like the fuel types are generalized for, like, if you're even near a pine tree, they're probably going to assume you're going to have pine straw on the ground, like in beds, and that's not. Anyway, these models are effective for, depending on where you are, you can get really great predictions of your intensity and how your fire will behave. And then of course, as you might, expect, there's checklists that we go through, and they're important. And then we go through them again at the end, just to make sure that we did what we said we were going to do, and that we're not just winging it. So, yeah, here's a picture of the weather that I talk about. And for days, even weeks leading up to one of these burns, your consulting forester is going to look at the fire weather forecast provided by NOAA and Fire Weather Service. They do these locally, and this one is for Montauk or Jefferson City area. It's this whole county. For smoke, we often try to get way higher vent rates. You can see 3,000 even is not good. You want higher vent rates that say good or fair for smoke to clear out. Yeah, relative humidities, those are pretty high. You want relative humidities to, between like 30 and 50% generally. Below 30 gets really, really dicey. Although in woodland, oftentimes that need to be there for you to even have a prescribed burn. So like on a northern slope in a forest farm setting, it's often a red flag day just to get any fire in there. So you might have relative humidity, and it may say down here, it's dangerous, don't burn. And those are generally my best establishment burns in an unburned forest. Okay. Yeah, this is what that looks like on paper. I know I'm just showing you guys the weather, but I want you to know that this is how, if you're going to plan a burn, this is how you do it. You look at this, you look at the vent rate, you look at the surface winds, the relative humidities, your rain potential, your mixing heights, and your vent rates. So you can know, and of course, these are terrible. These are really bad, but you want above 4 to 6,000 for vent rate, and mixing heights, I think over 1,000. Okay, burning, we're going to talk a little bit. I got some cool diagrams here, just what kind of burns if you're thinking about establishing a forest farm. Talked yesterday about low intensity backing fires, and that's actually what this is right here. He has a line all the way around it, but he's just burning into the wind and letting it back all the way across the unit in this diagram. As opposed to this one, he lit the fire with the wind. This is the head fire. This is the hot fire. The backing fire would have been very subtle, slow into the wind. This head fire is the one that rips and roars and kills everything in its path. If you're burning with the wind, that's a head fire. And then usually with topography and units or plants or whatever beds, whatever it is, you have to work on strip fires and manage this sort of with angles and work around whatever obstacles are in your way from topography to plots. So sometimes they're parallel, sometimes you're into the wind. Yeah, there's a lot of advantages. You got to know how fire reacts to fire. So these different interior ignition strips, as we would call them, are going to pull together. And so, but they're going to avoid, they're creating hot spots away from them. So fire always sucks together. And I'll show you that in these diagrams. We do these called spot fires intentionally, trying to create fire from coming together and making hot spots in a bed or somewhere where we don't want it. Alternatively, we do that to create hot spots over jackpots or something we really want to erase the debris or consume the debris. This is how I've burned like this before, backing over knobs and very, very steep ridges. But it can also be used successive rings around very steep ridges, but it's often used around very steep ridges, just this sort of mountain effect fire. And then finally, I wanted to get to this one. This is the most common one we all use, is the ring fire method, where you're basically going around all sides of a fire, so it sucks up together in the middle into the interior of the unit. And obviously we have adequate black line. It doesn't really necessarily matter the direction of the wind in this case, but I'll show you in my burns with Raylan over there at Busby, we did use different points, which I recommend, and had different routes in case of different winds. So we could use those different points to say, okay, actually, we're going to switch our plan. We're going B to A now. So anyway, it is mapped out. Now I'll show you the pictures and then I'm good for questions. So that's what a lot of these places looked like before. That's one burn. Actually, that's another agroforestry plot I just threw in there. This is thinning only with no fire, thinning and burning, and then when it grew back. So yeah, that's you could grow some ramps and good stuff in there, right? Okay. Any questions?
I hate to harp on the negative, but if
Do it, please.
something were to go terribly wrong,
Yeah.
who is responsible if someone's barn burns down or they lose some animals trapped in a pasture?
Yeah.
Who is
It's a
responsible?
great question. It's a great question. Essentially, it does come down to proving negligence. If my insurance would cover it, this is a weird area.
Mhm.
I'm insured for the fires I light, and you should check with your consulting forester to make sure he's insured for the fires he lights. But if you're just a landowner and you did it to your neighbor, I've seen it happen where the landowner actually did have lines in and wasn't really doing anything wrong.
Mhm.
Tree started spewing out of the top at like 30 feet and it spotted in the horse pasture way where no one could see it. And he wasn't negligent and he didn't actually have any, there was an insurance claim on the behalf of the landowner. He didn't actually pay for any of it. Yeah, legally, this is a gray area. I do think you gotta, I'm not the expert, I'll say that, but I've seen it work out litigation both ways, and actually proving negligence is actually much harder than you would think. But there's a history of doing this here too.
Yeah, I'm most concerned, as we talked about yesterday, of, this happening, being used more and more close to where people are, and especially as small landowners get more into doing this, just how you
Yeah.
can reassure your neighbors that, okay, if something goes wrong, if that chance thing happens, you're going to be covered.
Yeah.
And just, I think that would make you feel better, than this knowing that, well, oops, act of God would be very disturbing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
A couple of things that I've done to mitigate that risk is you can have contingency lines, and I think you touched on that, where, oh, it broke through my line. Guess what? We have another line that we've already planned for. We're falling back to it. Another, and sort of along the same lines, uh, dividing the burn units into smaller units, so that uh, if something goes wrong, you light a test fire at the beginning to see how the fire is behaving. And then that's sort of like a test plot, this is a good day, good conditions. But if you have a small unit, if you've got 5 acres and you break it into 5 1-acre sections instead of doing the whole thing, it's just a couple of extra lines that you put in there with the leaf blower in a forest system. And you're like, oh, this is spicy, and it's only 11 a.m. We're not going to do any more burns, because fire intensity is going to increase as relative humidity goes down going into the mid-afternoon. You just say, okay, we got an acre done. Uh, Nobody's house burned down. We're going to call this good for today. I've had that happen. You have to shut the fire down. And then you can come back sometimes in the evening when the relative humidity creeps back up and the wind dies down, and you can barely get it to burn. So, just an operational pause.
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely had to shut fires down. Just the test fire was more than exciting enough. And you decide that I'd rather do this a different day. Maybe just my nerve. Maybe the conditions are right, but not today. So,
Yeah. So I saw you talked about TSI. So in your experience, what combination of silvicultural practice and at what intensity can promote forage growth in case you're looking at silvopasture?
that's a great question. The site productivity, which we've discussed in depth, is like what site you're selecting, I think dictates that the most in my mind, which she and Badger both said. It's just the intensity that I'm going to cut that is, how intense and the land use history. Essentially, if I can get a healthy overstory there, and how far away I am from that dictates it. So if I need to cut really intensely, but I could have a mature oak overstory in 20 years doing it, I'm going to probably push for that. If I've already got an mature oak overstory in my silvopasture, I'm going to cut real light, right? Like I can subtly, with fire and thinning, remove whatever's clogging up that oak overstory. I'm not going to be very intensive, and especially knowing if whatever I cut lightly is going to grow back fast because it's rich, black, fertile. Well, you're doing a great job in your silvopasture. Then, yeah, my return interval will be much less frequently, or more frequent if it's more productive. So,
Thank you.
yeah.